Ibrahim Traoré on Bobi Wine and Africa's generational shift. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. What happens when an election stops feeling like a contest and starts feeling like a turning point for an entire generation? What happens when a country's future becomes a mirror for a continent still wrestling with long rule, youthful pressure, and the demand to be seen? In recent days, a message attributed to Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso has circulated widely in response to protest calls surrounding Uganda's 2026 election and the role of opposition figure Bobi Wine. The message isn't about telling Ugandans how to vote. It's about recognizing patterns, moments when systems react defensively, when visibility is restricted, and when legitimacy is tested. Tonight, we're going to examine why Uganda's moment resonates so far beyond its borders, why Bobi Wine has become a symbol rather than just a candidate, and what history suggests happens next when fear meets awakening. Stay with me. Dear friends, Uganda's 2026 election has taken on a meaning that extends well beyond ballots and tally sheets. For many Ugandans, and for observers across Africa, this moment feels like a referendum on time itself, on whether a system built decades ago can still contain the expectations of a generation that grew up connected, informed, and impatient with permanence. To understand why the message linked to Ibrahim Traoré resonated, we have to start with context. Uganda has been governed by the same leader since the mid-1980s. Over that span, an entire generation has been born, educated, and come of age without ever seeing a change at the top. In such environments, elections carry a different weight. They aren't simply about preference, they're about possibility. That's where Bobi Wine enters the story, not first as a politician, but as a symbol. His rise from music to public life reflects a broader shift, culture becoming politics and identity becoming mobilization. Supporters see in him a voice that speaks their frustrations plainly. Critics see a challenge to stability. Either way, the reaction reveals something important. Systems tend to fear symbols more than policies because symbols travel faster and organize people more effectively. The message attributed to Traoré frames Uganda's election within a familiar sequence. First comes rising tension, then pressure on opposition activity and independent reporting, then heightened security, and finally, measures that narrow visibility, restrictions that make it harder for citizens to document, share, and verify what's happening around them. This sequence isn't unique to Uganda. It has appeared in different forms across the continent and beyond. What changes over time are the tools. In earlier decades, control focused on print and broadcast. Today, it often focuses on bandwidth, who can connect, who can stream, and who can be seen. Why does that matter? Because legitimacy depends on shared reality. When citizens can see the same events, compare notes, and access independent accounts, disagreements are at least grounded in common evidence. When visibility is restricted, suspicion fills the gaps. Even clean procedures struggle to persuade when people feel shut out of the process. That's why internet shutdowns and restrictions on observers provoke such strong reactions. Supporters of these measures argue they reduce rumors and calm tensions. Critics argue they do the opposite, transforming uncertainty into doubt at the very moment trust is most fragile. The message linked to Traoré doesn't argue that change must be immediate or confrontational. In fact, its most consistent theme is restraint. It warns against youth-on-youth conflict, against communities being turned against one another during moments of high emotion. History shows that the most lasting damage during transitions is often done not by institutions, but by divisions among ordinary people. This is where the Pan-African framing becomes clear. Uganda's election is being watched in West Africa, in the Sahel, and across the diaspora. Not because everyone shares the same politics, but because many share the same questions. How long can systems remain closed to renewal? What happens when youthful demographics collide with entrenched power? And how do societies manage transitions without tearing themselves apart? Traoré's broader political posture emphasizes sovereignty and visibility, ideas shaped by experiences in the Sahel, where security arrangements and governance models often prioritized stability over participation. In that lens, Uganda's moment looks less like an isolated dispute and more like a test case. Can legitimacy be maintained when control replaces confidence? The generational dimension matters here. Young voters aren't simply numerous, they're networked. They compare experiences across borders. They see how elections unfold elsewhere. They recognize familiar playbooks. That recognition changes expectations. Silence no longer reassures, it alarms. At the same time, long-serving systems develop deep roots. Over decades, institutions, patronage networks, and security structures intertwine with leadership. In such systems, transitions are inherently risky. Supporters of continuity fear collapse. Opponents fear stagnation. Both fears are real, and both can drive extreme responses if not managed carefully. This is why the period after voting is often more volatile than Election Day itself. If continuity prevails, questions of legitimacy linger. If change is attempted, questions of acceptance arise. Either way, restraint and transparency become critical. The message associated with Traoré repeatedly returns to one point: awakening itself changes the landscape. Once people realize their collective weight, that realization doesn't disappear, even if outcomes disappoint. Moral victories, in this sense, aren't substitutes for governance, but they do reshape what governance must answer to next. That idea unsettles systems built on predictability. It's easier to manage apathy than engagement. It's easier to govern silence than conversation. When engagement rises, so do demands, for accountability, for rotation, for evidence. International responses complicate the picture. Reactions to restrictions often vary depending on alliances and interests. Citizens notice when principles are applied unevenly. Over time, selective concern erodes the credibility of democratic norms themselves. For American audiences, the lesson isn't to romanticize or demonize any actor. It's to recognize a structural shift. Elections are no longer just counted, they are witnessed. Control of visibility has become as consequential as control of institutions. So what does history suggest? Change rarely arrives exactly when people expect it. Sometimes it pauses, sometimes it advances quietly. But once awareness spreads, it's difficult to reverse. Systems can win contests on paper while losing confidence in practice. And confidence, once lost, is expensive to rebuild. Uganda's story, then, is not finished. It's unfolding. And as it does, it's asking a question that many countries are asking alongside it. Can legitimacy survive without visibility? Can systems adapt before pressure becomes rupture? Uganda's election will pass. What remains will be memory of how the moment was handled, how people treated one another, and whether institutions chose confidence over control. History records not only outcomes, but conduct. And the conduct chosen now will shape what comes next. Thank you for watching.